U.S. President Donald Trump speaking in the Oval Office this afternoon, and for the first time in days downplaying his threat to intervene in Iran. Without citing any evidence, Trump claimed to understand the killings in Iran had stopped, and from sources, he said, there would not be, quote, executions today. Now, human rights advocates say at least 2,400 protesters have been killed by the country's theocratic regime as it executes a brutal crackdown on demonstrators. Joining us now is Dennis Horak. He was one of Canada's last representatives to Iran before diplomatic ties were severed. He served as charge d'affaires from 2009 to 2012. Hi, Mr. Horak. Good to see you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
It was definitely, something to note to hear the president speak in those terms versus the way he has the previous few days. And I'll be totally transparent. All the analysis I've read has at times been contradictory. I see, some analysis that says, well, there aren't enough U.S. assets in place in order to strike Iran in the way that the president had described. So maybe he's just buying time. And then I see other analysis that says, look, the U.S. partners in the area were not supportive of opening up their airspace, for example, or of those military strikes. So likely he's just finding a way to back down from the initial threat. What does your gut tell you? What is your initial analysis of why he's saying this now?
Well, I think those are very viable possibilities, and all things can be true. I think also, I understand he got a military briefing, I think earlier this week. They may have advised him, quite rightly in my view, that what would be the objective of these military strikes? What would they be trying to do? How would that help the protesters? It was never clear to me what would happen that would make the protesters more successful by military strikes in Iran. There was talk about taking out the leadership, talk about taking out the security forces. And then what? We saw what happens when you try and change regimes by the air. We've seen that in Libya. I just don't see how that would have been a viable option in any case, and perhaps they're trying to walk that back now.
What kind of scale of intervention would be necessary in order to lead to the fall of the regime? Because you bring up a very salient point, right? Which is ultimately what these protesters are protesting is the behavior of the regime. So if the regime stays in place, then ultimately what is the purpose of the strikes? Like, is there a level of intervention that you think could essentially force the removal of the regime?
It's really hard to see what that would be. You could take out the leadership. You could take out headquarters for the Revolutionary Guard, the besieging militia, other elements of security forces, attack police stations, as they've said, and basically unleash anarchy. And then what? I don't know where that would lead. And would that be just in Tehran? Would that be across the country? What would that look like? What would the day after look like? I just don't see the viability of a military option in settling this. This will be how it's settled will ultimately be decided within Iran.
Can I also ask you about the relative grip on power that the regime has right now? I mean, you're intimately familiar with the regime's power over Iran over a long course of time. There's been changes in the region, obviously, via a lot of their proxies. Like, would you assess their grip on power to be less than it was, let's say, for example, even in 2022 at the time of the last series of protests of this scale?
Well, I think certainly their sense of invincibility, this sort of image of invincibility, has been taking a big blow over the past couple of years, and what sort of impact that has psychologically within the society is hard to measure, but I think certainly it would have an impact. But that being said, the security forces in Iran are ruthless, as we've seen over the past couple of weeks, and they seem to be still in place and able to lash out as and when they want. Whether they're in fact have stopped the killings, as the president says, or not, I mean, the information is very unclear at this point because of blackouts and various things, but certainly images that are coming out suggested that it's still a pretty brutal place. And they retain that power, they retain that brutality. And so insofar as that enhances their grip on society, which I think it does, then they're still in pretty good shape. But these demonstrations, I think, will add to pressure to do something different, to change the direction, that the status quo that has been in place for ages has to be revisited, because this is just going to keep happening and happening. I think the regime knows that. Whether they're capable of making the kind of changes necessary to deal with some of the grievances remains to be seen.
What does the blackout itself, this ability of the regime to essentially, make it so that no information can get out of Iran and that people can't communicate with each other, what does it tell you about what they're capable of?
It's kind of ironic because modern communications allows for much better coordination than obviously decades ago when the Iranian Revolution happened in '79. Information from the Ayatollah, who was in exile, was sent by a cassette tape. Now things are much more sophisticated and much more effective in terms of coordination and getting information around. By the same token, it's much easier to cut them off too, that you can have basically flip a switch essentially and you can cut communications. And it makes it much more difficult for organizers and others who are accustomed to dealing with an electronic world to deal with an analog world.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Mr. Horak, thanks so much for your insights this evening. Appreciate it as always.
My pleasure.